Justin Watkins from Native Digital to talk about right and wrong, lessons in shareable content. Justin.
All right. Thank you, Michael. So he said, my name is Justin Watkins, work at Native Digital, creative strategist there. The meat of what I'm going to share today is a checklist that we use to grade our content ideas, our creative ideas. So that's what you're going to see today. Feel free to take notes. If you don't want to take notes, follow us on one of these and we'll get it to you at some point. So I want to start with, first of all, does anybody watch the new Letterman on Netflix? The new format's kind of cool, right? We're talking about content today. We're talking about creative. It's funny to me because I think content feels like this new word to us, but content's been around for a long time. It's just become more of a buzzy word in the marketing world here lately. And I really think that the best content creators aren't necessarily marketers. It's people like David Letterman's of the world, right? This is my sketch of Letterman before the Santa beard showed up. What is the piece of content that you guys probably associate him with the most? If you think about his show, what was the thing that he did that you guys think of? Top 10 list. So he did the top 10 list for 29 years. So if you think about in your marketing efforts how hard it is to create content, he's doing this every night for 29 years. He had a team doing it, but that's very consistent and very hard to do. But they had this format that worked for them, right? So you knew what to expect. They knew that this was the format, this was the topic, and they put it together and they were able to do that consistently. I thought of this recently because as he was on a talk show, I think he was on the Norm Macdonald live show, and they were talking about one of their favorite top 10 moments. And it was, I believe in like 88 or 89, there was a topic that I think Letterman didn't think was funny or thought was maybe a little too sensitive. And so I think just hours before the show, he cut it. He said, we're not going to do this top 10. And so the writers backstage are scrambling, trying to figure out what the next top 10 is going to be because they've got the show coming up. And what they come up with in a pinch was the top 10 numbers between 1 and 10, which I thought was hilarious just hearing the title, right? And I'm not going to drag it out. I'll show you what it was. It's at number 10, it was 7. 9, it was 4. 6, it's 8.5. And of course, there's a two-way tie between 5 and 6 for number 1. They actually did this. I want to say it was in 88 or 89, and it was so. Everybody liked it so much, they actually redid it with Casey Kasem, I think 3 years later, and just had him come out, and it was a different set of numbers between 1 and 10. But when he retired, a lot of people reviewed his show and looked back at some of his shows, and that was repeatedly listed. If you Google the top 10 lists, this was almost always on that list. And it's striking to me because it wasn't because it was topical or anything. It's just that they had this format and people knew what to expect, and they were sitting there messing with the format. And people recognize that. They're messing with their own format. This top 10 list worked for him because every time they did a top 10 list, it was absurd, it was silly, it was very brief, almost always self-deprecating in some way. And again, people got to know it. They knew what the format was. It was 10. They did it at this particular point in the show. It was topical, and typically something about it was surprising. So what's that have to do with marketing and social media? Well, I think part of the point I'm going to walk through today is that we're all trying to figure out how to do marketing and social media right. Most of us read articles on it, we read books, we go to meetings like this, we try to figure out what those best practices are that we can learn so we can try to do this the right way. Marketing is not easy, it's kind of mysterious, but we're trying to figure this out. And if we just keep doing that, we're going to figure out the right way one of these days and everything's going to start clicking for us, right? What I've noticed in my career is that people tend to fall into one of these camps. So as they're trying to figure out the right way to do marketing, they tend to fall into either the data camp or sort of the creative camp. So people who kind of go to the data camp, they're looking at the science of analytics. It's more the strategic planning. They're trying to figure out how to craft the exact correct plan to make sure they can reach people. It's very scientific, again, in the way they go about that. I call them scientists. And then there's also the creative people that they just want to feel the thing that's right for them. There's a lot of emotion and intuition into it. So they're always trying to figure out the thing that's going to be the most compelling and feel good to people. And I call these the artists. If you look at most companies, if you look at most marketing companies, if they're a small group, they tend to be a group of scientists or they tend to be a group of artists. Because usually there's one person who started it and they surround themselves with people who think the same way. Because they tend to not be able to stand other type of person because they think differently, right? If you're at a big company, they usually have really great people in both of these camps. and they're in different departments because they argue all the time or they ignore each other. So we have at Native Digital tried, and we're going to continue to keep trying to do this, to have both of them. And because we're small, we have to put them in the same room, and we try to be friends. Shout out to the natives in the back. We try to force them to like each other and talk to each other and respect each other's opinions and where they're coming from. But this is typically what we're basically saying to ourselves or under our breath in all of our meetings, which is the scientist is saying, listen, trust me, I've done the research, I've got the numbers, here's the plan. And the artist is usually brought in after the fact and says, this is intimidating and confusing and boring, and we're just going to do what feels right. And that's typically how this plays out in most meetings. So again, we're committed to trying to bring these groups together and make sure we can use both of those strengths. So the way we solve that is not easy. But the way we can do this is we bake that into our process, make sure that both different types of camps are involved at different places, that we're looking at the best practices of both of those different worlds. And we can create checklists like the one I'm about to show you to make sure that as we start to head down this path, we're balancing both sides of that. And of course, you want to measure that and make sure that you're actually getting there, not just feeling that you're getting there. So for us, we really think that, science will find your audience, but the art is going to grab their attention when you get there. So these are really two important things that you got to make sure you're hitting on both of those. So again, if we're all studying the same best practices and we're all going to the same sessions and reading the same books, more than likely everything's going to start to look and sound the same, which is true, and that's kind of what happens. So you got to figure out ways how you're going to stand out. So it's helpful that you have these checklists that kind of push you, and your first idea gets pushed a little bit into maybe a little bit more uncomfortable space, and find a way to make sure that stands out. So I'm going to share our content creation checklist that we use to kind of grade our ideas. And before I show you the list, I want to talk about when you use a list, because I think when you use it is really important. In my experience with people on the client side, or really any industry, the common thing is we need to come up with an idea, so let's schedule an hour meeting. We'll bring everybody who needs to be involved into this meeting, and we will start suggesting ideas. Usually the loudest person in the room is the one who suggests those ideas. You get one or two ideas out. We start evaluating those ideas, and the one that's the best wins, and that's it. That doesn't work, and don't apply the checklist in that situation. What I think does work is get the people in the room, all good ideas, as many ideas as possible. It's divergent thinking. Have as many good ideas. Don't grade them at all. Do a second meeting, more ideas, more ideas. In the third meeting, break out the checklist, start prioritizing those ideas, get it down to a few, and then run those ideas through the checklist. The best way to have a good idea is have a lot of ideas. So don't apply this to your first idea. So with that, it's a top 10 list also. So number one, does it open strong? If you think about how much time and attention you're going to get out of your audience, we all know this, you're going to get just a few seconds. If you think about the speed at which you go through your Facebook feed, if you're even on Facebook anymore, you're going to get about 1 or 2 seconds, right? So that headline has to be punchy, and that opening scene in the video has to really grab their attention. Either do something that's surprising or something that shows what they're going to get. Number two is it digestible? And I bet everybody in this room knows this, that it has to be kind of short and kind of bite-sized, kind of nuggets of content. I think we all know that. What I also see happen is that if you write an article or you shoot a great video, as you start to put it together, you really fall in love with everything that you wrote or everything that you shot. And you know that people are only going to watch it for 1:30, but you got 5 minutes of awesome footage, and you can't cut it because it's all so great. You have to cut your darlings. And so it doesn't matter how much you love it, the crowd is not going to love it. So find that, make it tight. People only remember the home runs. So don't show them everything that you did throughout the game. Number three, what emotion does it bring out? So I think this is another one that we also remember. We know that if it's not emotional, it's not really going to connect with people. But again, typically what I see is that the thing that we want to say is very informative. We have this information, we want to take it to the audience. And if there is no emotion in it, it's just going to fall flat. So find a way to take that information that someone has asked you to communicate and find a way to put a little bit of emotion into it. One helpful way is if you're trying to communicate 10 things, don't communicate 10 things, just pick one. For today, it's just one thing, and how do you make that some sort of emotion to it? Tomorrow, you can talk about point 2 and figure out a way to put emotion into that one. Number 4, Does this help our audience? Does it speak to their needs? Again, I don't think this is like groundbreaking advice, but it's just good stuff to remember. You know, as you're coming up with these ideas, typically you're coming up with ideas that serve your needs, not your audience needs. So I think one of the roles that we play a lot when we help our clients is we're just there to remind them that their audience doesn't care about that actually. And so how do we frame that up in a way that their audience does care about it, and then get your information in there. Number 5, do people feel cool or like insiders talking about it? So I think one of the things that is a good example of this is if you see a lot of behind the scenes footage, you see a lot of like TV shows starting to do a lot more like behind the scenes. I think I saw Good Morning America the other day. They had all of their hosts with their cameras pointed at them, showing them coming to the show and behind the scenes and the interns and the makeup and all that type of stuff. Like people understand now that getting access to things that they otherwise didn't have, a peek behind the curtain, it makes you feel like you're special and that you have access to something other people don't. It's a pretty simple thing, but you know, people are starting to pick up on that. The world has become a little bit more transparent, and you kind of see behind that curtain a little bit more. So if there's ways to do that with your content, is there's something that your audience otherwise would not have access to that you can start giving them a preview of. That's interesting to them. And if they can brag that they saw it because it was exclusive or it was the first time or it was behind the scenes, people react well to that. Number 6 is it part of a broader narrative among our audience? What's your audience talking about? What do they care about? What's topical for them today? If they're already talking about it and you have a way that's not a complete hack or completely transparent advertising to attach yourself to that, then they're going to talk about it as well. There's a risk here in the sense that you can try to insert your brand into places it doesn't belong, and that's a great way to get made fun of and called out. But if you can do this in a genuine way, it's going to work. So number 7 is, how can I make it more public? Or how will people show that they've seen it or interacted with it? So if you think about the Ice Bucket Challenge, that's like the thing that everybody wanted to get to because they had this way that people could say, I saw it, I did it, I'm challenging people. I'm not saying that everybody needs to do that, but if you just think about the simple way of how can people participate in it, how can they interact with it? Are you posing questions that they can answer? Are there ways that you can have more dialogue? Basically the thought of, am I just talking to them, or do I let them talk to me, and is there some sort of interaction? Or is there a way for them to talk among their friends about this thing? That's a tricky one. That's one of the toughest ones, I think, to answer on this list. But it's a question worth asking, because if you can get to that, that can be a really powerful thing. One point I would make on this 10-point checklist as we go through it is, as you come up with your ideas, what I've seen is that our ideas almost always flunk this list. We don't have good answers for these questions. It sounds so good to us, and as we go through these one at a time, we don't have a good answer for it. And so what we have to do is think, which of these are most likely? How can we change this idea a little bit to answer a few of these well? So our goal isn't to answer all 10 of these questions really well. Our goal is to answer maybe 4 of them well. This is a tough list. I mean, it sounds really basic, but to have an idea that just hits on all of these doesn't happen very often. So again, you go through it and you pick your spots. You think, well, I don't know how to make it public, but I can make it helpful. Number 8, we used to do this separately. We used to say, all right, let's have our checklist. This used to be a 7-point checklist. And then we'd go open up the brand guideline book, and we'd say, all right, does it match all the brand guidelines? So we just brought this into our list so we can have one list. And what we did was we framed it up this way. We said, does this idea support the brand position of blank? Or does it distract away from it? One of the reasons why we picked brand position is because if you don't know what your brand position is, you got a bigger problem. You need to always be trying to represent this idea to your audience. And if you don't know what that is yet, or you think it's one of 5 things, then you probably don't have a brand position. And so that kind of checks you and says, we got to figure out what our position is and why we're putting this content out here. What is the purpose that it's serving for the brand? So if you think about brands that have very clear positions, Coors Light is always one that comes to me. They want to be the coldest beer. So any content that they put out should probably support this idea that we have the coldest beer possible. And if you think about some of the ads that they've put out, it's pretty frosty. I mean, it's pretty cold stuff, right? We just started working with Virgin Mobile. Everything needs to be rebellious, right? That's their position. They're the rebellious brand. We've done some analysis on the New York Times with our work with Politico. They're all about truth. And so everything they're talking about is like truth in journalism. So you're not going to see anything that they do that doesn't support that brand position. So think about what your brand position is and think, are we just putting stuff out there, or are we really building this idea up to where when people think about us, they think of that thing? Number 9 is, how is this different between what our competitors are saying? Is it too similar? Can we become known for this? A lot of us put out the same stuff. We put out the same types of formats. And so if our competitor is saying this and we're saying it, and the only difference is it's coming from us instead of them, it's not that different. And so you got to try to challenge yourself to think, in what way can I make this different? One exercise that's kind of fun on this question is, what can we put out that our competitors would never put out? Like, they would never be willing to do this because they don't want to give up that information, or that person doesn't know how to speak like this, or they would never give away these types of tips. Or those. That's a helpful thing, because if it works for you, then they're not going to imitate it. So that's a fun exercise to go through. So I'm blazing through these top 9 because I'm trying to get to the 10th one, which is my favorite one. Definitely my favorite one. And it used to be this. Originally the question was, is it unexpected? And I think it was about 4 years ago, I gathered a creative team together and I said, anytime you guys bring work to a creative director, please make sure there's an unexpected element to it. We don't want to see any work that doesn't have some piece of unexpected element to it. And everybody nodded their head and went back to their desks. And the reason why we said that was because a lot of our stuff's online, and we've seen everything online. Like, there's nothing surprising online. We've seen it all. So we've got to find something that's unexpected that stands out. But we had one designer who walked up and said, hey, Justin, hey, he's the only person who spoke up. He said, any tips on like how to make that unexpected? And he's totally the type of person who would ask that, and I appreciate it because I did not have a good answer for him. I had sat there and gathered the whole team together, said, make sure you do this. Don't show any of us something that's not unexpected. And they said, sure, or whatever. And they walked off their desk. And that's what happens all the time. People say, make sure you're doing this, and then I have no idea how you do that. So I recognized that I'd asked him to do something that I didn't know how to do. So I gathered him back later after I changed the question, and the question changed to what can we do wrong and what best practice can we break? So again, we talked about how we're all trying to figure this out, trying to figure out the wrong way. I'm just giving them permission to do something wrong. So F something up, like just screw with it a little bit. What can we do? Because what I realized was that as I started studying things that I thought were unexpected, what I realized was everything that they were doing was they were just breaking rules. It's pretty simple. That's a whole lot simpler than to say just make it unexpected. So that became the new rule, and it's become my favorite one. And now that I've identified that, I see it everywhere. Everything that I think is interesting is because it was done wrong somehow. And it is everywhere. If you start noticing this stuff, you'll be the same way. So why is it that wrong works? Partly because wrong is real. Like, real life is not clean and perfect like a lot of marketing is. Real life is messy, and like they say, error is human, right? Wrong is real, it's believable, and it's interesting too. The other reason is that we are all very highly trained consumers. We can smell advertising a mile away. We know the formats, we know the formulas, we know what a commercial is supposed to look like, we know where the logo goes on a print ad, we know how a good paid social post should go. So we know what that's supposed to be like. When you mess with that format, it starts to get a whole lot more interesting. So again, let's look at some examples of good content, and I don't want to use marketing initially. Let's go back to some of the really good content creators who aren't marketers. Let's go back to late night TV and talk about how they've done things wrong and why it's worked. So the first one is one of my favorites, SNL. And the first one I think of is like, Jimmy Fallon just broke all the time. He was just basically paid to just laugh on these skits. I mean, that's what he did half the time. And we all remember him for that. I mean, who remembers anything else besides that, other than maybe the Barry Gibb talk show or what it was? But the breaks, they don't plan it, but when they do it, it's funny and it works. And that's the stuff that people look up on YouTube and watch over and over again. I don't watch Kimmel, but the one thing I know about Kimmel is that he flipped the pranking around. Kids are supposed to prank parents. That's how it's supposed to go. Parents aren't supposed to prank kids. And that's one of his shticks that I know, is that he's flipped that around. He's doing it wrong. Conan I do watch, and I always loved the year 2000, and I especially loved it when it was 2001 and 2002, and they're still doing the year 2000. He does a lot of things wrong, and that's why I watch him. But I thought this was another classic case of messing with the format and doing things wrong. And then when you get into the other talk shows, if you think about all the PBS shows, they were doing something wrong in the sense that they were stripping their set down. Daytime TV was so polished and so slick and had so many graphics, and here they are just sitting with a little round table and a black backdrop, that it became a thing, and people started doing that, and they started stripping it down to these minimalist shows. And so even shows like, I don't know if anybody's a Hot Ones fan, I'm a huge Hot Ones fan. They do the same thing. They strip it down to a very basic concept. It's like anti-TV. So as I'm telling you about my love for this, this method of doing things wrong, one thing that I've realized is that once I got onto this and I started realizing it, I started doing things a little too wrong at times, and it just looks messy. It just looks sloppy. So don't go overboard like I did there for a little bit, where things were about 50% wrong and it just looks sloppy. The trick to me that I've found is that it needs to be about 90% right, and make that 10% wrong, to where it almost looks like it really was an oversight or a mistake, or it's not just sloppy, right? So I think that 90-10 split is probably the place to be. So a couple examples of how we've used that in our work, just to show you how we've applied it to things that are content or ad creative. Politico is one of our clients, and they had a B2B product that some would probably consider boring and a little bit just is policy information. People were subscribing to get all this policy information. It wasn't the big fun headlines. It was just like really detailed stuff. And the campaign that we came out with, we took where the headlines would normally be and we just blocked it out. And the tagline was basically, when you need to go beyond the headlines, because the audience we were talking to just needed the details. So we broke a rule. We took the headlines and just blocked them out. So nobody else was running ads that had just big white blocks on the top of it, but we went there because we were trying to drive home a point. So we hid the headline. The city of San Jose asked our team to rebrand them, and they talked to, I don't know, probably 12 agencies, and basically what they told us was we were the only ones who had a different process for going about it. So the thing we did wrong was the process, not necessarily the work. They talked to 12 agencies. 12 agencies said, we were going to create a logo and we were going to roll out a national campaign, and we're going to make people really fall in love with San Jose, and they're going to move their businesses here and their families here. And we said, we're going to talk to your residents, we're going to design a logo with them, then we'll show it to you. And then we'll do like live screening, printing of t-shirts, and we'll put out stickers and t-shirts. And then a year from now, then we'll put out an ad campaign after they've adopted it and say that they're willing to buy into it. And they picked us because of that, because they didn't want the city to reject it. So that, we just flipped the process on that one. We just did the process wrong, and nobody else was willing to do that. So when you're doing this, you really have to earn trust to experiment, because this is scary things to a business owner or to your boss. When you say, hey, I just learned that we're going to break rules and it's going to work great, they're like, get out of here. It's not going to work. So it helps if you really know the brand and you're not breaking rules on the brand. It helps if you know the audience and really know what the audience want. And it really helps if you know how to sell this thing. So if you get this idea and you know this is going to work, you have to find a way to fight for your idea and sell that through the organization or sell that through to your boss or your client. If you can't sell that through and you don't have confidence in it, they're not going to have confidence in it either. So you have to think of a way that you're going to sell that idea through. Another example that we did with a client was with Tallgrass Brewing, and they had a beer called 8-Bit that's really tasty. And we really became obsessed with these lo-fi graphics, and a lot of the competitors were looking really polished. And we said, how can we go lo-fi with this? So we took simple photographs and put these little 8-bit characters dancing around, and everything looked just very retro, kind of video game. And we felt like it was kind of breaking a rule in the sense that it was just going so kind of 80s, 90s old school, where everybody else was so polished. And then the last example, I got two more examples, I think. Duvel, the parent company of Boulevard, asked us to do some work on the brand and the audience and social media content. They have a really high tier quality beverage in Duvel. It's very tasty if you haven't had it before. And this is about the same time that the breakout rooms were really starting to become a thing, and every suburb had a breakout room, and everybody was doing the breakout room challenge. And so we just flipped that idea and we said, all right, let's do it wrong. Let's break into the room to get this really tasty beer. So we were going to do that for them. Now, they liked this idea, but they didn't do this. And this is going to happen all the time. If you start suggesting things that you feel like are wrong or you flipped it around, you can't get scared. If they don't like your idea or someone says you're crazy because you're breaking too many rules, like, just have fun with it. It's okay. Don't let that ever stop you from trying to twist those ideas and trying to break some rules. If it flops, that's part of it. If everybody bought into your wrong idea, I would be amazed. And it's probably not wrong enough if that's the case. The last example I'll show you is we do a lot of video work, and we're always trying to make sure that we can hook somebody in the first few seconds. We did a really tough assignment in Bourbon Country not too long ago, and the opening for the Bourbon Country video is we had a group of very attractive 20, 30-year-olds sampling bourbon, and one of the guys was a bit of a lightweight and really struggling with his shots of bourbon. His girlfriend was doing great. She's had, I think, a couple shots right here, and he's struggling on his first one. So he's got tears running down his face and had already signed the waiver that said we can, or the talent release that said we could use the footage. So as we're seeing him struggle through it, we're like, this is definitely going in the intro. But again, we're taking those outtakes that you typically wait till the very end to see. We're putting it right at the very beginning. So seeing this guy struggle with his shots is the thing that catches your attention, and will let you watch this tourism video to see why you should go to Lexington, Kentucky. So that is our 10-point checklist. The last thing I would say to you guys is we all work in a very fun industry. There's a lot of other jobs that we could have that are much more boring than this. Let's have fun with it and stay loose and stay light and break some rules. Thanks a lot, guys.